December 17, 1944, 5:30 a.m., Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, and died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic sound cracking through the cold, dark air. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, tried to coax the big Maybach back to life. Nothing. The fuel gauge sat on empty. Moments later, Hauptscharführer Weber shouted up from his compartment, his voice tight, almost panicked. The reserve tank was bone dry too. Peiper climbed down from his command tank, boots crunching on frozen Belgian soil. All around him, the supposedly unstoppable armored spearhead of Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Ardennes offensive sat stranded. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, almost 5,000 of Germany's best Waffen-SS troops, and not a drop of fuel between them. Through the morning mist, Peiper saw the abandoned American outpost just ahead. Honsfeld, a key supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had run so fast they left fires still burning in oil drums, coffee still steaming in metal cups, and almost unbelievable rows and rows of jerry cans. Thousands of them, olive drab, stacked like offerings from the god of war himself. Peiper moved closer, almost in awe. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, pried open a can and sniffed. Benzene, high-octane American gasoline. Peiper's men wasted no time, tearing into the piles, refueling their machines like their lives depended on it, because they did. Peiper started counting. The amount of fuel was staggering. 50,000 gallons, enough to power his entire Kampfgruppe all the way to the Meuse River, enough, maybe, to turn the whole offensive around. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this one depot than most German divisions had seen in half a year. But as Peiper watched his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a heavy realization settled on him, colder than the morning mist. If the Americans could just leave behind that much fuel, if they could afford to lose what Germany would defend with entire divisions, then Germany was finished. They hadn't just miscalculated, they'd misunderstood everything about their enemy. 6 months before, back in June, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, laid a report on the Führer's desk. It should have ended all German offensive plans on the spot. Allied bombers had gutted Germany's synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. The lunar works, which turned out 175,000 tons of fuel in April, barely managed 5,000 tons by September. The hydrogenation plants at Politz, Berlin, and Brooks limped along at less than 10% capacity. The numbers spelled doom. In 1944, the United States pumped out 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, counting every drop from synthetic plants and stolen Romanian oil fields, scraped together just 33 million barrels, not even 2% of what America produced. The Third Reich was trying to fight a mechanized war with horse carts. While American armies drowned in gasoline, Major Friedrich Seemann from Wehrmacht Logistics had done the math. The Ardennes offensive would need 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler set aside 5 million, but only half ever made it to the front, thanks to bombed railways and clogged roads. The German High Command wasn't planning to win with strength. They were gambling it all on stealing Allied supplies. Meanwhile, the Americans ran pipelines under the English Channel and across France. Pluto, they called it. The Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy of trucks, hauled 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every day. By December, American forces in Europe were burning 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and getting even more shipped in. They fought and built up reserves at the same time. Peiper wasn't naive. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, already decorated with the Knight's Cross and a veteran of the Eastern Front. He knew better than most that in modern war, fuel meant life. His Kampfgruppe was the spear point of the entire Ardennes assault. 2 days before the attack, at the final briefing in Tondorf, General Sepp Dietrich didn't sugarcoat it. You'll have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. Peiper's allocation was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat. The Meuse was 65 miles away. Failure wasn't just possible, it was built into the plan from the start. As his column readied to move on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders. Tanks rolled out in single file, trying to save every drop of fuel. If they stopped for more than 5 minutes, engines went silent. Grabbing American fuel dumps mattered more than any battlefield objective. The Germans were desperate. You could see the difference between the two armies in a single morning. Just 20 miles from where Peiper started, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion wrote in his diary, "Got 8,000 gallons of fuel delivered. Third delivery this week. Tanks are full, storage overflowing." December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. on the German side, the opening barrage for Operation Watch on the Rhine burned through more shells in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had used for entire operations earlier in the war. It looked impressive, but behind the noise, they were running on empty. Peiper's column started late, 7 a.m., already behind. The roads that looked like highways on their maps turned out to be narrow, bumpy country lanes. Most weren't even paved. Within hours, trucks and tanks jammed up, big vehicles designed for the Russian steppes now crawling through the thick Ardennes forest. At Lanzarote, the first stop, they hit a wall. 18 American soldiers from a recon platoon. Just 18, but they held back the whole German armored force for almost 10 hours. While the Germans waited, tanks sat idling, wasting precious fuel. By the time they broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, they'd gone 20 miles and burned through 40% of their fuel. At this pace, they'd be out of gas before they were even halfway to the Meuse. The supply depot at Honsfeld wasn't anything special. It was just a forward fuel point for the 99th Infantry, what the U.S. Army called a Class 3B depot, a temporary station. But when Peiper's men got there, they found more fuel than a whole German panzer division got in a month. Hans Grulra, one of Peiper's officers, later described the scene. "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each holding 5 gallons. They were stacked 10 feet high, stretching for maybe 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even tried to destroy them. The fuel was high octane, good enough for planes mixed with motor fuel at 80 octane or higher. German tanks like the Tiger were built for 74 octane. The American gas was actually too good. Some German engines started acting up. As the men topped off their tanks, they kept finding more." Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who could read English from his pre-war days in his father's import business, found shipping papers in the depot office. The fuel had come all the way from Texas to New York, crossed the Atlantic to Liverpool, hopped the Channel to Normandy, and then was trucked almost 400 miles to Honsfeld. 6,000 miles in under 6 weeks. Hoffmann later remembered showing the papers to Peiper. Peiper read them twice, then crumpled them up. He didn't say a word, just went pale. They both knew what it meant. Meanwhile, Private Ernst Karrer found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline bragged about a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, pumping 300,000 gallons a day. One pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Peiper's whole group could burn in the entire offensive. To really get Peiper's shock, you have to understand how bad Germany's fuel situation was in late 1944, Allied bombing had crushed synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe kept planes grounded for lack of fuel. Pilot training dropped from 250 hours to just 60. The Navy's big ships stopped leaving port. U-boats got snorkels so they could run on batteries to save diesel. And back home, nobody drove cars. Gasoline was so scarce, the Gestapo chased down black market thefts of single liters. Farmers went back to horse-drawn plows. While all this was happening, the U.S. pumped out 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more than all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries were running so flat out that Standard Oil started inventing new petroleum by-products just to use up the surplus. With the 50,000 gallons they captured at Honsfeld, Peiper's column pushed ahead. By noon on December 17th, they'd taken Billingen, grabbed more supplies, rations, ammo, and most importantly, maps showing other American fuel dumps nearby. But the maps told a grim story. The Americans had fuel everywhere, every crossroads, another depot. The First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons waiting. Peiper kept pushing, heading for Ligneville. There, his forces would commit the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. Even this war crime came down to desperation for fuel. Peiper later said he just didn't have enough gas to transport prisoners. By the evening of December 17th, his spearhead rolled into Stavelot, where the Americans had a massive fuel depot, over 2 million gallons just sitting there. That was more than enough to get his tanks to the Meuse. But the Americans weren't going to let that happen. Captain John Brewster from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion got a heads up about the Germans and knew exactly what he had to do. Don't let the enemy get the fuel no matter what. The depot was huge. 289,000 gallons of gasoline in jerry cans spread across 15 acres. At 4:30 p.m., with German tanks closing in, Brewster gave the order. His engineers started pouring gasoline between the stacks, then handed out white phosphorus grenades. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis tossed the first one. He said the explosion was instant and massive. A wall of fire shot 100 feet into the air. In just a few minutes, the whole depot turned into a raging firestorm. When Peiper's lead tanks arrived, all they saw was a column of black smoke stretching 1,000 feet high. That blaze would burn for 3 days, destroying enough fuel to send Peiper's division all the way to Antwerp and back. Unterführer Weber described the scene. The Obersturmführer just stood on his tank watching the flames. He didn't say a word for 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and finally spoke. They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep it from us. What are we even doing here? All across the Ardennes, American engineers were torching their own fuel dumps rather than let the Germans grab them. At Tuapon, 1.1 million gallons went up in smoke. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons vanished. During just the first week, Americans destroyed over 8 million gallons, more than the Germans had set aside for the whole operation. How could they do that? It all came down to logistics the Germans just couldn't match. The Red Ball Express, a round-the-clock operation with 6,000 trucks, delivered 412,000 tons of supplies. Each truck burned 40 gallons a day. The supply convoys themselves chewed through more fuel than the entire German Army Group B got in a month. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service had 230 truck companies running on color-coded routes. They moved 20,000 tons of supplies every day, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, First Army's logistics chief, jotted this down on December 18th. Fuel in 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel out 1,623,000 gallons. So the reserves actually grew by 224,000 gallons. And the pipelines? Even more impressive. Operation Pluto had laid pipes under the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons a day from Britain. The pipeline network reached deep inland. The Cherbourg-Paris line moved 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line pumped 650,000. By December, Allied forces in northwest Europe were burning through 7.5 million gallons a day, but still receiving 8.2 million. They weren't just fighting, they were stockpiling. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the hopelessness of the German position became obvious. At shore, they grabbed another depot, 5,000 gallons gone in just 3 hours of fighting. Tiger tanks guzzled 2.5 gallons per mile during combat. Panthers burned 1.5. In the rough Ardennes terrain, those numbers jumped by 40%. Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, wrote, "By noon on December 18th, we'd burned through 67,000 gallons since the offensive started. Maybe we captured 55,000. We were already behind." The Americans knew all about Peiper's fuel crisis thanks to ultra intercepts. General Courtney Hodges ordered everyone, "The enemy is desperately short of gas. Destroy any stocks at risk of capture." That same day, American C-47s flew 316 missions to Bastogne, dropping supplies, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans airdropped more fuel to a single surrounded garrison than Peiper's whole group had. By December 19th, as Peiper's men fought at Stoumont, the fuel problem was now a full-blown crisis. Tanks started getting left behind, not because they were knocked out, but because they were bone dry. Peiper scraped together the last of his fuel, maybe 8,000 gallons, just enough for one more fight or a retreat, not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were looking ahead to January. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland asked for 245 million gallons for the next month. Nobody even blinked. They approved it on the spot. But the difference wasn't just about quantity. American vehicles were built for efficiency. Sherman tanks averaged 0.8 gallons per mile, while Tigers chewed up 2.5. Loaded American trucks got 8 miles per gallon. Parts were interchangeable, repairs were simpler. The Germans, on the other hand, had a jumble of different vehicles, captured and homemade, each with their own parts and quirks. French tanks even needed different oil than German Panthers. It was a logistical nightmare. Soviet trucks needed different parts than the German Opels, and every mismatch made the supply problems worse. On December 20th, Peiper got a radio message. Allied planes had wiped out the fuel convoy. No more gas. Use what you have. Peiper called his officers. Vera Perker didn't sugarcoat it. "We've got enough fuel for maybe 20 kilometers. The target's 30 away." Gruller backed her up, quoting the Oberschirmbannführer. "Gentlemen, we're up against an enemy who burns more fuel to keep it from us than we ever got for this whole operation. What we took at Honsfeld felt miraculous, but to them it was nothing. We can't win." This idea was sinking in all over. General Hasso von Manteuffel, leading the 5th Panzer Army, wrote later, "When I heard the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons instead of risking us capturing it, I knew the offensive was lost before it started." Colonel Friedrich von Donder, captured on December 23rd, told his interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure it by liters. How do we fight that kind of abundance?" By December 21st, Peiper was boxed in at Lays. His tanks had no fuel. Americans had him surrounded. 31st Infantry, 82nd Airborne, 3rd Armored. Just on December 21st, those units got 340,000 gallons of fuel. Peiper had maybe 1,000, private, first class. Richard McKinney wrote home, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." The American response was industrial war at full throttle. When Patton's Third Army turned north, it took 350,000 gallons of fuel just to get moving. The Germans would have called it impossible, but the Americans pulled it off in 3 days. December 23rd, skies cleared. Allied planes flew 2,000 sorties, burning through fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47s chewed up 300 gallons an hour. B-26s 200. 1 day of flying used more fuel than Germany's entire offensive allocation. That night, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and fled on foot. Out of 119 tanks and assault guns that started the push, only 39 were still working, but they couldn't move. The crews destroyed them with the last of the ammo. Heinz Goels described it. "We drained the last drops from every vehicle, maybe 200 gallons total. The boss blew up his own command tank, millions of Reichsmarks of equipment gone, all for lack of fuel. Of the 5,000 men who started with Peiper, about 770 made it back. They'd pushed 60 miles, grabbed a few depots, and learned the hard truth about Allied logistics. Word spread fast up the German chain of command. On December 26th, Field Marshal Model got reports on captured American supplies. His chief of staff wrote down Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the numbers twice. 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed instead of captured. He said, "We're not fighting the same war." Hitler heard the news on December 28th and refused to believe it. Speer wrote, "Hitler said the numbers were propaganda. Even after seeing photos of burning Stavelot, he claimed it was Hollywood tricks." But the lower ranks weren't fooled. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we get in a month. They drive tanks like we march. This war is lost." The fuel crisis showed a bigger truth. By 1944, America was pumping out half the world's manufactured goods. A new plane every 5 minutes, a ship every day, a tank every 7. Petroleum numbers were staggering. U.S. seared 1.8 billion barrels. Soviet Union, 110 million. Germany, even counting synthetic, 33 million. Japan, 2.6 million. The whole Axis made less than 2% of America's oil. Every big German attack after 1942 had been held back by fuel shortages. Every American offensive rolled forward, backed by supplies German planners couldn't even imagine. On December 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen noted a telling moment. A logistics officer reported that bad weather had cut fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons a day. People started to worry until someone pointed out that was more than Germany's entire offensive got. German prisoners from the Ardennes couldn't get over the American waste. Seeing GIs toss half-eaten rations or use gasoline for heating shook their morale even more than the artillery. Oskar Reichelm told his captors, "We knew your production numbers in theory, but seeing soldiers waste more than we ever had made it real." Every German who saw how casually you lived knew the war was hopeless. This knowledge spread in letters despite censors. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. We can't fight infinity." The idea of German racial superiority crumbled when they saw how Americans, who they called decadent, had so much while the so-called master race struggled to get by. At the Nuremberg trials, German leaders kept blaming logistics, especially fuel, for their defeat. Field Marshal Kittel didn't mince words about, "We had the upper hand in 1940 and 41. By 44, we couldn't even move our troops for lack of fuel, and the Americans moved armies around like chess pieces." Peiper, who stood trial for the Malmedy massacre, put it just as plainly. After December 17th, every decision came down to fuel. They couldn't maneuver, retreat, or chase the enemy. While Americans drove wherever they wanted, Germans counted every last liter. General Heinz Guderian summed it up. When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, it meant everything to him, but nothing to the Americans. That's when the war was over. That story sticks because it marks the end of old-fashioned warfare. After that, the battles weren't won by courage or tactics. They were decided by who could outproduce the other. The romance of war died in the Ardennes, among abandoned tanks with empty fuel tanks. Historian Richard Overy worked out the numbers. By 1944, the Allies outproduced the Axis by more than 5-1 in most military categories. For oil, it was almost 50-1. No amount of training or clever tactics could make up for that. America built 324,750 aircraft in the war. Germany managed 119,907. The Americans rolled out 88,410 tanks. Germany, 46,857. But the real story was oil. In 1944, America refined 1.8 billion barrels. Germany scraped together just 33 million. December 24th, 1944. Peiper's men tried to slip through American lines on foot, leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles. They'd captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, a miracle for them. But for the Americans, it barely registered. Unterführer reflected on it years later. That morning at Honsfeld, when we found American fuel, we celebrated like we'd hit the lottery. By evening, after hearing about Stavelot burning, we knew we'd already lost. Americans had so much they could destroy, what we would have died to get. That 50,000 gallons was less than what a single American armored division chewed through in 2 days. The Red Ball Express burned that much in 3 hours. For the Allies, it was nothing. Major General J. Lawton Collins said it best. The Germans' desperate attempts to capture fuel showed their mistake. They thought we valued fuel the same way they did, like it was irreplaceable. They couldn't imagine we had so much we could burn millions just to avoid a setback. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed because of simple industrial math. The German offensive burned through 2.8 million gallons, about 40% of all their fuel for that period. They only made the difference by capturing what they could. Meanwhile, the Americans used 267 million gallons, almost 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. But the real loss was their illusion. Every German who saw American abundance realized they weren't fighting a war. They were taking part in their own execution. Peiper survived, imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes. He was murdered at home in France in 1976 by unknown attackers. But back in 1967, he told a historian, finding that fuel depot was the worst thing. If we'd run out sooner, we could have retreated with dignity. Instead, we found out the Americans had oceans and we had drops. We found out it was impossible. The lesson goes way beyond World War II. In industrial wars, logistics wins. Production beats courage. Abundance crushes dedication. The German soldier in 1944 was probably better trained and more experienced, but it made no difference. The Americans had an industrial machine behind them that could waste more than Germany could ever produce. You could see that truth in every empty jerry can at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline stretching across France. Wars between industrial giants get decided in factories and refineries, not by genius generals. Colonel Trevor Dupuy did the math. In December 1944, each American soldier got 67 pounds of supplies every day. Each German got just 3. Americans complained about waste. Germans would have seen it as unimaginable abundance. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans gathered at La Glaise. The museum still has Peiper's Tiger tank left where it ran out of fuel. December 23rd, 1944, former Unteroffizier Karl Wortmann stood by the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson from the 30th Infantry Division. Anderson said, "We always wondered why you stopped. We thought it was tactical. Wortmann just laughed, bitterly. We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that? Anderson turned quiet. We never knew you were that short. We had so much. We never thought about it. That moment says it all about December 1944, one side measured by the gallon, the other by the millions. One fought for every jerry can. The other burned oceans. The ending was never in doubt. German records make that painfully clear. Just look at Army Group B's war diary from December 1944, December 16th, the offensive kicks off. They start with only 70% of the fuel they need, already running on fumes. December 17th, Peiper's men manage to grab 50,000 gallons, but it's not enough. December 18th, American forces destroy multiple fuel depots, wiping out over 5 million gallons. By December 19th, German units are stuck. No fuel means no movement. On Christmas Eve, Peiper abandons his vehicles. They're simply out of gas. Across the lines, things look completely different. On December 16th, First Army reports having 3.7 million gallons in reserve. The next day, they lose 2.2 million, but then get 1.8 million back on the 18th. By December 24th, reserves are up to 4.1 million. The Americans handle millions of gallons like it's nothing, while the Germans ration every drop, counting out individual cans. But it wasn't just about how much fuel each side had. American fuel meant better technology. Their refineries mastered catalytic cracking, turning out high-octane gas way more efficiently than the Germans ever could. American planes ran on 100-octane fuel, giving them a real edge over German aircraft stuck with 87-octane synthetic. Additives like tetraethyl lead, ethylene, and special detergents gave American engines more power and reliability. The Germans just couldn't keep up. Their engines, built for lower quality fuel, often ran rough, even when they managed to seize American gas. The fuel shortage touched every German soldier. Hans Müller wrote in his diary on December 20th, march 30 kilometers on foot, no fuel for trucks, passing abandoned American vehicles, still idling for warmth. They leave their engines running. We march through snow. Medical services were paralyzed. Ambulances couldn't move the wounded. Hospitals sat in the dark because generators had no fuel. Men died, waiting for a ride that would never come. Dr. Wilhelm Kersting remembered, "We had excellent surgeons, plenty of supplies from captured American stores, but no fuel for ambulances. Men died who could have been saved if we'd had enough fuel to move them 10 kilometers." The truth shattered every myth German propaganda had built. Soldiers had been told Americans were soft, spoiled. Then they saw Americans destroying more fuel in a day than Germany had in total. Goebbels' diary, December 28th, reports indicate serious morale problems. Soldiers write about American superiority undermining our narrative. Word spread faster than censors could keep up. The myth of German superiority collapsed in the face of American logistics. After the Ardennes, Germany had nothing left but desperation. General Jodl said it at Nuremberg. After the Ardennes, we knew it was lost. We'd played our last card and discovered the enemy held all aces. The Allies saw the truth and zeroed in on what was left of German fuel production. By February 1945, Germany's fuel output was finished. The Luftwaffe grounded. Training stopped. The Wehrmacht froze in place, picked apart by Allied armies that could move wherever they wanted. Spring 1945 brought the strangest scenes. German units surrendered not because they'd all been defeated, but because they couldn't move. Whole panzer divisions just sat by the roadside helpless as American columns rolled past. General Major Fritz Bohlin wrote, "We had 42 operational tanks, experienced crews, plenty of ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel, enough to get to the next town maybe. We destroyed our tanks and walked into captivity." Meanwhile, the Americans' biggest problem was traffic jams. Third Army alone had 15,000 vehicles. Peiper's fuel crisis sums up the whole war. Industrial power decided everything. That December morning, standing among piles of captured jerry cans, Peiper realized the truth. The enemy wasted more fuel than Germany could ever hope to have. The numbers say it all. The Germans allocated 5 million gallons for the offensive. Americans destroyed 8 million gallons just to keep it out of German hands. Americans burned through 7.5 million gallons a day. Peiper's big haul at Honsfeld, 50,000 gallons, wasn't even 1% of a single day's American supply. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and maybe 100,000 Germans. It wiped out the Wehrmacht's last reserves. But its real legacy was the realization that America's resources were simply on another level. What Peiper discovered wasn't just about fuel, it was about industrial warfare. Victory went to whoever could build and supply the most oil, steel, aluminum. Germany never stood a chance. Here's the final gut punch. When American forces catalogued abandoned German equipment at La Glaise, they found 39 perfect tanks left behind only because there was no fuel. Major Robert Harrison's report, fuel required 8,000 gallons, classification minimal, source local reserve. Time 4 hours. For the Germans, 8,000 gallons was an impossible dream. For the Americans, it barely registered, a routine request from local supplies that easily topped Peiper's entire captured stockpile. That was Peiper's real discovery at Honsfeld. It wasn't just that America had more fuel. It was that American abundance operated on a scale so massive German shortages simply didn't matter. The war ended as soon as American industry kicked into gear. Honsfeld just confirmed what everyone knew back in 1942. Germany was doomed from the moment they tried to fight a war they couldn't supply, counting their losses by the gallon, while America was winning by the ocean. Now, there's a Tiger tank in Le Glace's museum. Its fuel gauge stuck on empty. It's a memorial to the day when brilliant tactics ran headfirst into the cold wall of logistics and lost. People still walk by and wonder why a tank that strong got left behind. The reason's simple: no fuel.